All right.
All right. I guess I'll go ahead and kick it off. Welcome to day 3 of the Streetlit Symposium. Tonight's event is the Redemption event. It's Redemption Songs, a Cautionary Tale, Morality Plays, and Street Literature. Again, I am Dennis Winston, Editor-in-Chief of Words, Beats, and Life. And tonight I am co-moderating with my good friend and colleague and fellow scholar, Keenan Norris of San Jose State University. And we'd like to introduce to you all our panel for this evening. First up, I guess I'll do the first introduction. First up is Brother Hoke Glover, affectionately known as Brother Yao. He is a professor of English at Bowie State University. In 1992, he founded Karibu Books as a vending operation with locations at Bowie State University, Howard University, and other locations throughout the Washington, D.C. area. By 2005, Karibu Books had become the largest African-American bookstore in the country. Glover's creative works cover a wide variety of subjects. His poetry has been published in Crab Orchard Review, Plowshares, Obsidian 3, Joint, Rattle, A Smartish Pace, and a host of other journals. His first book of poetry, Inheritance, is published by Willow Books in 2016, which centers around family and attempts to distill the everyday wisdom and evolving experiences of family life. Currently, his work is focused on a manuscript titled Crazy as Hell, which takes a satirical look at Black revolutionary thought and action through the lens of insanity, which is to say that to be to be Black and a revolutionary in America is to be, to some degree, crazy as hell. Brother Yao's co-author, which is our next guest this evening, is Professor Valerie Prince. Professor Prince is an associate professor in the Department of African American Studies at Wayne State University. Her work centers on African American women and their various modes of recovery. Her first 2 books, Burning Down the House, Home and African American Literature, published in 2005, and Daughters Exchange, explores these themes in detail. Her current work explores the history of domestic work among African American women, particularly in their role as washerwomen. So thank you, Brother Yao and Professor Prince, for joining us today.
All right, now I'd like to introduce our other 2 panelists for the day. First is Justin Gifford. Justin Gifford is an associate professor of English literature and a nationally recognized biographer and scholar of American literature and culture. His research and teaching focus is on African American archives, popular literature, and Black radicalism. He's the critically acclaimed author of 3 books, including the definitive biographies of Iceberg Slim and Eldridge Cleaver. His book, Street Poison, was chosen as one of the Amazon.com's top 100 books of the year, and his work has appeared in such publications as the Journal of Higher Ed and Melis. He has been instrumental in the publication of Iceberg Slim's final unpublished novels, and his expertise landed him a role in the Ice-T produced documentary, Iceberg Slim, Portrait of a Pimp. He's currently a professor of English at the University of Nevada, Reno, where he is teaching, among other things, an American history class on Zoom to 180 students, and a class on Afrofuturism and Black science fiction. Dr. Gifford's work extends beyond the university community. He teaches an American literature course to inmates at the Northern Nevada Correctional Center, and he brings college students into the prison where they all discuss literature together. His new book, Revolution or Death, The Story of Eldridge Cleaver, tells the story of one of the most infamous Black radicals in American history, and it untangles the complicated history of the Black Panther Party's rise and fall. Thank you for being here, Dr. Gifford. And secondly, Trevin Jones. Professor Trevin Jones is a faculty member at St. Louis Community College, where he teaches English composition, African American history, and 1960s movement and culture. His tenure as an educator spans over 2 decades, and he is committed to helping students develop academically and professionally. In addition, his scholarly work and ongoing interests are in African American male slave narratives and prison narratives. He examines the intersections of identity, masculinity, and spirituality, and how the institution of slavery mirrors mass incarceration. Trevin holds a bachelor's degree in English from the University of Oklahoma, a master's in English from Old Dominion, and a doctoral degree in American Studies from St. Louis University. Professor Jones, thank you for being here as well. All right, so the first leg of this is that we just want to hear from each one of the panelists and give y'all 3, 4, 5 minutes to just express your first general thoughts on the topic of street lit as redemption narratives and morality plays. All right, your just general thoughts. I don't think we discussed who we'd start with, so I'm just gonna start with Dr. Gifford here, if that's fine with you.
Sure, that's great. No problem. I thought I might just take a minute or two to tell you about my connection to street lit, how I came to street lit in the first place, and then talk a little bit about this idea of redemption. So when I started graduate school in 1998, my first teacher was Toni Morrison at the University of Chicago. And this, of course, transformed my understanding of American and African-American literature and sent me down a path where I eventually became an African-American studies professor at the University of Nevada. But at the same time that I was working at the University of Chicago, I was also working in the local high schools on the South Side. And at one point I was talking to a student about the work I was doing at the university, and he said, who is it that you're reading over there at the university? And I said, oh, I'm reading Toni Morrison, somewhat arrogantly. And he said, well, you haven't really read anything until you've read this. And he hands me a copy of Iceberg Slim's Pimp. And I had never seen Pimp before. As a white guy growing up in a working class neighborhood in Seattle, this was just not something that I came across in my young life. So I started reading my way through Pimp, and a few years later, I was in Harlem walking down the street, and I saw a book table with not only Pimp, but all these street literature books all over it. And so I thought, there is something really important going on here in literature that no one in the academia is really talking about. And so I started buying up all of the street literature that I could find. And one day I was using this brand new tool called eBay and searching for books, and I came across an auction that had these shoes. These shoes belonged to Iceberg Slim. And in fact, there was a whole series of auctions that were auctioning off all of his suits and his shirts and his shoes. So I bought everything. And I ended up contacting the person who was selling them, who turned out to be his wife. And over the course of the next 15 years or so, I interviewed his wife, and she had all of these unpublished materials to give me, including 2 novels that we ended up publishing together. Now, what is really important about Iceberg Slim for me is that at its root, Iceberg Slim's narrative is a narrative about redemption. It's a confessional. It starts off in the preface with this admission that the whole reason that he's writing the novel is to try to steer young men and women away from the street poison that he experienced in the life. But what's also interesting about Iceberg Slim is that he's publishing with a company that was white-owned called Holloway House Books. And this was a book company that was owned by 2 Hollywood copywriters named Bentley Morris and Ralph Weinstock. And the way that they marketed those books is that they would put things on the back like, this gives you a secret inside look at the jungle that lurks beneath every city. So incredibly racist advertising copy on the books. And so the thing that I would say here at the end of my 5 minutes is that street literature is essentially this divided commodity. On the one hand, it is doing these redemption stories, many times from people who are formerly incarcerated. And it's at the same time, they're often marketed by unscrupulous publishers who are looking to make a quick buck. So,
yeah, thank you for those initial comments. And then Dr. Jones, I became aware of your work through your essay on Malcolm X's redemption narrative. Could you please say a few opening words about your work? Did we? Can we please bring Dr. Jones back up, or did
we lose him?
We might have lost him. Well, let's go to Dennis. Can you?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, if I'm not sure if Brother Yao is still there. I think his camera went dark as well. So okay, so I'll start with you, and maybe we can go straight to Professor Prince afterwards. So your thoughts on this idea of redemption? I'm really curious to talk to you because you own Karibu Books, which a Black-owned bookstore is so much like what Justin talks about, seeing this table filled with street lit. My first sort of introduction to street lit was through a Black bookstore in Greensboro, North Carolina, known as the No Bookstore.
Yeah.
So I was drawn to those kinds of texts, going into that bookstore. So I know that you have some experience with that. But yeah, speaking broadly, what are your thoughts about this notion of the redemption narrative in street literature and its importance?
Yeah, and one of the things that Justin mentioned was Holloway House and the idea of street literature as a commodity. And I mean, perhaps in the same way that an African American who is profiled by the police has little redemption, as a Black man who owned a Black bookstore and lost close to $1 million. I mean, what's redemption? Somebody give me my money back? And I sold the literature. I managed the relationship with the customers. If we go to the idea of communal activism, I was a good steward. I was a good servant. I ran the best Black bookstore it's ever been run in the country. And in the end, when I lose $1 million, people look at me like I'm a step and fetch it, and perhaps I didn't know how to manage my money. But if I didn't know how to manage my money, then I wouldn't have had 6 stores and 160,000 customers. So perhaps when we get to the question of economics, I mean, maybe there isn't any redemption for Black folks when it comes to economics. Maybe that's why we position arguments, for the public that suggests that we need more federal aid and we need something else from the government, or we need reparations. I mean, if we have a notion of reparations that exists in the country, what does that say about redemption? That means that Black folks for generations have lost money, and when they lose money, they don't get any redemption. I think within the context of street life literature, what you have is sort of the opposite of redemption, which is Horatio Alger, and I'm going to get the American dream whatever way I can get it. And if a Black man decides to do that, and I'm not the one, because I ran a legitimate business, but if a Black man or Black woman decides to do that on the street life arena, in the street life arena, what it turns into is a question of how do you break the law, bankroll your cash, and move forward in that way. And again, I talked to a student of mine recently. I called him early in the morning because he's a friend of my son's. And they told me about his father. And he said, man, his father, man, is a lot like you. Like he smells like incense oil all the time. He be spouting strange bits of African-American wisdom. Talk like a street dude. He said, but I heard his father did time. And his father in 1988 was a drug dealer. Now his father don't live where I live. His father lived up on Connecticut Avenue, right near the zoo. And when I heard that he was living there, I was like, how the hell, man, you living over there, man? He was like, nah, that's my dad, man. So part of what the beauty of a street life narrative is about is that when people get paid, even if they go to jail, they still keep the bank. It doesn't work that way for the honest Black folks, so maybe that's part of, maybe it's not redemption, maybe it's hard line, cutthroat American capitalism taken to a new level. And in the same way, people that sold drugs to China, people that, managed the war in Iraq, Halliburton ain't going bankrupt. Maybe in the same way that the narratives of this country say, you kill all these damn Indians and ain't nobody taking your money. You can do the insurance jump, run back a MacArthur fellowship, and a whole bunch of Black folks who study in literature say, oh, I'm a genius and I want the award, and it ain't got nothing to do with the money. Once you get the money in the bank and you cash it up, I mean, what's the question of redemption after that? And perhaps that's part of the question that Street Life raises.
Yeah, there's often been that link between redemption and financial success, right? Finding redemption in financial success, especially in the streets. Ms. Prince, Professor Prince, any thoughts to share in terms of redemption and African-American literature, and perhaps in the work that you're doing?
Well, we've introduced so many different ideas already. I guess I'll pull back and just say how I come to this place. My focus has never really been on street literature per se, but I have, as years have passed, become increasingly more increasingly interested in stories that are outside of traditional borders of literature and academia. And I was reminded actually that when I was in high school, I was, I think, 16, and I was on a newspaper staff, and I petitioned and was granted the right to do a column about my grandmother. And in some ways, I have not really left far from that place, the place that I began in my teenage years. I went through school and I followed that academic path, but it was always because I was trying to get at answers to questions that I had that were deeply rooted in my community. And I remember in grad school asking one of my professors or saying to one of my professors, not really asking so much as lamenting the fact that I'm in this program and it seems intent on assimilating me into something that's very different from where I come from. And I said to him, you know, we're talking about all of this theory. We got Derrida, we got Foucault, we got all of this stuff. And that's wonderful and great. And I actually love this stuff. But I want to be able to talk to my mother. I want to be able to talk to the people in my home place, because that's why I'm here. And he kind of gave me this really snarky laugh. And he was like, you'll never be able to talk to your mother about this. And I was like, well, what's wrong with my mama? What are you saying about my mother? And it never sat well with me, the idea that there was no theory within the African-American community. It doesn't sit well with me that we have to go off to these French schools of thought. And I mean, there's highly refined training and all of that, and that's wonderful. But it seemed to me that there was something inherent in the community that worked to do a similar work to this other work that I was being trained to do in the academy. And I think for my own approach to this kind of outsider work is akin to when Ralph Ellison writes in Invisible Man about plunging outside of history. African Americans at the core are outside history. I teach this, what I introduced to my students, an article from newspaper in 1915 in Jasper County, Georgia, which is where my mother's people are from. And it's about a lynching. The Barber family was lynched. It was the father, his son, and his two daughters. And the article, I just give it to my students without explanation. I often put it alongside, Ida B. Wells or Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, and I just hand them the newspaper article, and it says so much because it's clearly ridiculous. It reads like a comic book. It does not read like a newspaper article. And so for me, that is the thing, that the newspaper article is given to us as history. It's given to us as a nonfiction text, as a document, and there's no truth in it. The truth of that experience is not captured there. And that's the thing that pulls me to where I am now, where I'm writing about things that are not captured in the traditional academic records.
Thank you. for that, Dr. Prince. And I want to come now to Dr. Jones here, who, like I said earlier, your article on Malcolm X's redemption narrative. But yeah, please just talk about our topic here.
Sure.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so let me just start by saying thank you so much for having me on your panel today. For me, my segue into autobiography Malcolm X, prison narratives was really quite personal. I have a brother who's incarcerated, and so as an undergraduate student at Oklahoma University, I started reading prison memoirs because I wanted so badly to understand his experience, and that led me to Soul and Ice by Cleaver, Soul on Fire by Cleaver. It led me to Blue Rage Black Redemption by Tookie Williams. And so I just immersed myself in these prison narratives. And I found their stories very redeeming in terms of these men being able to educate themselves, these individuals being able to really move in a new direction in life. And it was quite telling for me. I say that my interest lies in, of course, slave narratives and prison narratives, because I see so many parallels between, African-American slaves being able to redefine themselves as human beings, become literate, become educated, etc. And then of course, I kind of see the same thing also with many people who've gone to prison. Unfortunately, we have a high population of individuals who've gone to prison who didn't have a high school education, but in prison they began to educate themselves. And so redemption to me, what I'm thinking about the narratives, what I'm thinking about just even other stories, I think about people awakening to themselves and awakening to a world that maybe they weren't a part of before. And so I think that's what really kind of drives my interest as well. And currently I'm actually working on a book right now myself, where I'm kind of bringing together letters that I've written to my brother, letters he's written to me over the past 20 plus years, and actually really putting our story together. And I like to say that it's a human story. Oftentimes people kind of dismiss people who are in prison as, quote, the other, but yet these are still human beings. These are still individuals who can still make new decisions, still make new changes. And I think that's what continues to kind of drive my interest in prison literature, just in general.
Yeah, thank you for that, for that background and that personal as well as literary history. My first question is for back to you, Dr. Jones. Malcolm X, Iceberg Slim, and other autobiographies of the American streets consciously construct themselves as larger than life figures of criminality and redemptive reinvention.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this such a popular narrative construct for African-American autobiography and for American urban narrative? I'll also put that question in the chat so that everybody can see it. Yeah, let me start there.
Okay, here. Okay, so I'm going to kind of try to process your question.
Sure.
I think the reason why autobiography of Malcolm X is so I guess it resonates with so many people, whether they're inmates, whether they're outside of prison, is because it is a story where you have someone who kind of I don't want to say grew up in the streets, but yet he did a lot of things. He did a lot of things that would be considered the street life, and so. Whether it was selling drugs or whether it was hustling people, et cetera, but yet he was able to, I would say, kind of find his way. And I like to kind of say that in some sense the streets kind of raised Malcolm in a sense, but yet we know that once he goes to prison, he has this awakening with his religion. But I think it speaks to a lot of us, myself included. Because it just kind of shows sort of this life trajectory that's able to kind of change, that's able to kind of do something different, even though he comes from such a hard and tough background. I mean, we kind of see him kind of evolving and changing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. And a second question is for Dr. Gifford, how does the street lit redemption narrative change from Malcolm to Iceberg, right? And why do you think Iceberg alters it, given that Malcolm, inspired him to become a writer and share his story?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think there's so many answers to this, but I'll just kind of focus on two things. I mean, one is that even though Malcolm X's narrative has a kind of criminal element as part of the story, he commits these crimes and then he goes to prison and then he starts reading the dictionary and transforms himself into a kind of like master of literature. Slim's narrative is much more focused on the crime aspects of this. And I think that partly has to do, again, with the kind of mass market quality of the book, that the publishers were really interested in the kind of like slumming it, essentially, and having Iceberg really play up those details of the story rather than the redemption part of the story. What also strikes me as very different between Malcolm X and Iceberg Slim is that Iceberg Slim's language is so steeped in the street itself that it needed a dictionary in the back of the book for people to know what the hell was going on. In fact, his publishers told him, we can't read this book. We don't understand this book. We need a glossary so that people can have some access. And, ironically enough, it was precisely this feature of the book that made it so popular among young hip hop stars like Ice-T and Ice Cube and Jay-Z. All of them really were drawn to the specific kind of vernacular of that book. And so in that way, it's a lot like it's kind of like Iceberg Slim's like the Mark Twain of modern Black literature, in the way that he's able to create a whole new vocabulary, a whole new language that then transforms itself into hip hop later.
Thank you for that. All right. Dennis, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, I have the next question. This is for Brother Yao, and again, this is me really just being drawn to your experience with the with Karibu books. So the question I have is, when I think about the success of publishing houses like Holloway House in 60s and 70s, and I think about the success of your bookstore in the 90s, I'm always struck not so much by the fact of a large Black readership, but the fact that readership is almost exclusively interested in African-American street literature. First, the question that I have is, did you expect the success of your bookstore to coincide with this resurgence of urban fiction in the 90s? And then the next part of the question is, why do you think the redemptive narrative in street literature appeals so much to Black readers? Oh, you're on mute.
No, we're still not hearing you.
You're still not hearing me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. You're good. You're good.
Yeah, but as someone that did the accounting and buying for a 6-store operation that did about $4 million in sales, which translates to about $300K a month, $600K in December, the assertion that our readers were primarily interested in street literature is probably more oversight of the academic community. It's like the academic community, if they walk into a bookstore and they see that you sell Iceberg Slim, they think that you're not a real bookseller, right? Because it's not real literature. But if you're the bookseller and you also happen to be a bookseller with an MFA and a poet, you're not even a real nigger. I mean, like, you're off the scale, because if you were going to sell street literature, you couldn't have an MFA, because if you had an MFA, you would know that wasn't real literature. So the truth of Karibu Books is that we were a comprehensive Black bookstore that managed the truth and the reality of African-American readership in this country. And we sold books for academics, for intellectuals, for people that were Afrocentric, for people that were interested in children's books, for people that were on the alternative perspective and wanted to read African holistic health and learn about herbs and fruits. And we were the diaspora. But part of the way that it works, and again, with your question, Dennis, I think it reflects a sentiment that comes from the academic community, that perhaps because we sold street literature, we were only selling street literature because we wanted to make money. But the truth is, we were selling street literature in the same way that Black Art said, we want to create books for Black readers. We began with a more academic perception, but our readership, our customer base said, these are the books it is that we want to read. And we answered to that. But then after we answered to that, then perhaps it became this assumption that we were just selling street literature. But I'll tell you this, in terms of the numbers, and I discussed this with Dr. Prince earlier today, 10% of the inventory is street life books. It accounts for 30 to 40% of the sales. So within the context of the sales base of the store, it disproportionately reflects a larger amount of sales than any other inventory. But that's just 10%. On the other side, you have 90% of the inventory, which reflects, say, 70% of the sales. And that 90% of the inventory reflects all of these other diverse issues. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing, when you get to the question of redemption, at the heart of African-American literature is the idea of confession, the idea of telling a secret. We're downloads for this idea of heaven and hell, Christianity, who it is that we want to be. And so the idea that you have redeemed yourself is probably the most powerful consumer perception that you can put forth in a book. It's like saying, I once was lost, but now I'm found. So the heart of these particular narratives and my idea about African-American literature is we haven't even touched the surface. In truth, the problem with street life literature may be that it seeks that same redemptive narrative, but it doesn't reconcile itself in the same way that other American literature, other African-American literature reconciles itself with the theory and the history and the structure that's been downloaded to us by academia. So part of what you find in street life literature is just the redemptive, but that redemptive is probably an overlay of the idea of Christianity. Again, if there's heaven and hell, there's white and black, there's sin and righteousness, who the hell don't want to be redemptive? What more powerful thing can you say to somebody, which is that I was a sinner, and these are all the wrong things it is that I did, and then now I'm better, and this is who I am. But the issue is that when you get to street life literature, part of the reason it doesn't reconcile with the rest of literature, the rest of American literature, is that redemptive notion may be part of a farce. That hustlers still hustlers. They still bang. They still have a sensitivity and a way that they deal with the elements that are supposed to be the black underground or the people that are supposed to be outside the law that other folks don't have.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So the next question is for Professor Prince, and this has a lot to do with the work that you and Yao, Brother Yao, are currently working on, Crazy as Hell. And one of the things that I always think about the work that we do, right, as intellectuals and scholars and teachers, is that in many ways we're doing a kind of redemptive process by archiving the voices of the voiceless. And quite often those voiceless folks are seemingly unredeemable. They're the bad guys, they're the criminals, they're the inmates that, society typically labels them as unredeemable. But your book, Crazy as Hell, does the work of archiving a lot of these voices. You have these sections called the badass, the inmate, the murderer. Your approach is satire, but at the same time, you're archiving these voices that through the course of American history is routinely denigrated. How do you think that the work, what do you think that the work that you're doing, or would you describe your work as kind of the process of redeeming these marginalized voices?
Well, I'm not sure I would use that word for some of the reasons that Brother Yao just mentioned, in that sense, because of the complications that the sense of righteousness brings to the matter. I was talking to him earlier about this question, And the idea of redeem in, like, I lived in Michigan, where you can pick up a bottle and take it to the store and redeem it for a dime. And when you're in grad school, a dime, you can add up dimes and put some gas in your car. That kind of way of collecting and then getting something in exchange, I get. The morality question gets to be very problematic because of the complexities. I mean, to be Black in America has been to be outlawed, right? That's the way Black people enter. So when we're looking at our work, this book, it's called Crazy as Hell, the best little guide to Black history. And what we do is we, as you've alluded to, introduce categories. And these categories are about reframing the way we approach history. So it's about capturing on a page what we already know. And the problem is not what we know, the problem is the page. That's where the difficulty is. It's the page and the industries that produce pages. What is allowed to be expressed. I mean, we talk about censorship in other contexts. We don't often talk about censorship in the American context, but there's a way that African Americans are completely and utterly censored in terms of the way we frame and shape the way we think about ourselves. And Crazy as Hell kind of just like throws that out. We're not really concerned about the way somebody else might look at us, which is why Redemption troubles me in relationship to this particular work. If I'm going out and gathering and collecting to redeem, that's one thing. But if we're trying to be more moral, I think that's really problematic for African Americans. So you have a sense like you have a category, the outlaw, which might be everybody Black in America. And you have a category of lawless or the badass or whatever. And what we're trying to say is these people are human. And there's this range that they represent in the way they approach life that is captured in our everydayness. So you take a figure like Martin Luther King, who we now have this enormous monument to on the mall, and he's frozen in time. He's standing there. And even without that monument, we have the image of him captured on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, given the I Have a Dream. So we capture these moments as image, and that's American history. But in Crazy as Hell, we're like, did you know? But I mean, I know someone who knew him, and she was like, did you know? And you can do that with every single figure that we talk about in the book because they were people. And if they were people like us, then we're people like them. And I think that's what we're trying to get at when we go outside, when we go plunge outside of history. You know, that's what we're trying to get at. There's this beautiful, ugly, messy humanity that does not get captured often through traditional literature and approaches to African Americans.
Thank you, Dr. Prince. I've resonated with many things you said, especially in regard to Crazy as Hell. I got to read that book. And Brother Yao, kind of makes me wish I wasn't the moderator so I could say more. But what I want to ask both Dr. Jones and Dr. Gifford here is whether either of you would like to respond to anything that has been said so far. Just and also real quick, I meant to say this first. Folks who are listening, if you have questions, we will try to give the last 10 minutes or so over to any questions that y'all would like to pose out in the audience. But first, let me come back to our panelists, Dr. Jones, Dr. Gifford. If either of you would like to respond to anything that's been said so far.
You can go first.
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. I just wanted to respond to something that Brother Yao said earlier about the kind of constitution of readership and how, although academia kind of tends to think of these things as quite separate, the street literature audience and the canonical literature audience, that in fact that these things are very permeable. And I just want to actually echo what he said by saying a little bit about my own experience working in a prison, where one might expect that, and this is true, that many of the inmates are very excited to read, say, Iceberg Slim or Eldridge Cleaver because it directly reflects their own experience. But one of the things that I've come to find that was maybe somewhat unexpected for me, and maybe this is a reflection of my own kind of narrow thinking, was that they equally enjoyed things like The Handmaid's Tale and Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and The Great Gatsby, because of course the mind is a hungry thing and doesn't necessarily follow the rules of compartmentalization that we have in society. So just echoing what Brother Yao said, I just think that there is a lot more cross-pollination going on among audiences, and I've certainly seen that myself amongst the inmates that I teach.
And I guess I would like to kind of also just comment as well on what Brother Yao was talking about, just about the literature maybe not fitting into a nice category, not having a happy ending, but yet it's still a story. It's a human story. And that always takes me back to prison narratives that oftentimes may not reflect the majority of people's experience, but however, it's still an experience that's valid, and it's still a story that's worth being told as well. And what I found in reading prison literature is that these authors who may not be recognized like a Faulkner or a Mark Twain, they are phenomenal writers. They're phenomenal storytellers, and I get lost in the stories. But even beyond that, I relate to their humanity, and it's universal. It's universal, and so and it's okay if the story doesn't have a happy end. It's okay if the inmate is not free at the end of the story, or if the inmate, like Tookie Williams, ends up being he ends up being killed, of course, in prison. But yet that story, those words are still speaking to us today. And so I think that's what's beautiful about the stories that may not have the beautiful, happy ending like we'd like to see, etc. So yeah, and I too want to purchase the book Crazy as Hell and possibly use it in my classroom. So I'm excited about maybe reading it over winter break and seeing how I can integrate that into one of my courses. Thank you.
I think Brother Yao, you had a comment you want to make.
Yeah, and Trevin, man, you know, one of the things that's interesting about Crazy as Hell is that you know, Dr. Prince and I have been trying to bust up the literary industry. So we were looking for an agent, and you know, Dwayne Betts actually worked for Karibu Books. He spent 8 years of his life in prison, and I met him at Bowie State University maybe 3 months after he got out of prison, and he told me he'd read Etheridge Knight, Sonia Sanchez, Yusef Komanyaka, and when he told me he read that, I said, well, logically, you should be working in my bookstore. And you know, Dwayne has gone on to become a poet, you know, of record. He's published 3 books, the most recent one by Norton. He also had a Soros Fellowship, Harvard Radcliffe Fellowship, got his Yale Law degree. But when we took Crazy as Hell to him, he said, I want to write the introduction. So part of what I want to share with you is his memoir, A Question of Freedom, is a prison narrative. And one of the interesting things about that prison narrative is the way that prison narrative may challenge, because we exist in a different time frame. To write about prison from the perspective of Eldridge Cleaver, Malcolm X, Etheridge Knight, and who's the other person that I'm thinking about? But and Soul of That Brother, George Jackson.
Yeah, read that one. Yeah.
To write about prison in the 70s is a different thing than to write about prison now. Just this week, Dr. Prince and I read an article published by Dwayne Betts, and everybody should Google it, published in the New York Times, that was about, what is it, Kamala Harris?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I'm out the loop, right? I don't even listen. Yeah, but the vice presidential candidate that's a black woman that's gonna make history, right? Mass incarceration and me. So think about that. Think about a prison narrative being juxtaposed to the issue or the idea of mass incarceration within contemporary discussions or the way it exists in society. And think about how different that is from Malcolm saying, or George saying, I went to prison, that's why I know I'm burning this shit down. Malcolm saying, I went to prison, and that's why the white man is devil.
Exactly.
And
right.
this is the way it is that I'm working. Whereas for Dwayne, he represents an evolution of that prison narrative into this generation, in which the validity of the experience of having been imprisoned, when there's an idea that exists in society that relates to mass incarceration, puts him in a position where the New York Times verifies his opinions of a vice presidential candidate. So again, in terms of the evolution of the literature and where we stand. But the other thing about that is he's going to write the introduction to Crazy as Hell.
Awesome. Love it. Love it.
All right.
Good.
Absolutely. No, and to me, I think that's sort of what my question was getting at, was this idea that, you know, the African American literature sort of exists in this duality, right? It's American history, but it's also African American history that's often you know, defined differently than American history. It kind of takes the work that we're doing in many ways to bring it to light. It's sort of what Trevin was saying earlier about redemption being a kind of awakening to themselves and an awakening for the world in these kinds of narratives. So, you know, it sounds to me like a lot of the work that we're doing is part of that reaffirming process, if not for ourselves, at least, you know, saying this for the world, saying this for mainstream American society, that these voices, these stories matter.
Yeah, and at this point, one, if there are any other questions, we would be glad to answer them. But let's just keep it rolling. First of all, I did want to say, you know, I live in California, and so you know, where Kamala Harris was, you know, the police chief, the state attorney general. And now, you know, it's in the senator, right? And so, I mean, there's definitely been a lot of, you know, very heated debate, you know, in Black circles out here as to, you know, what to kind of, you know, do with her vice presidential candidacy, right? Yeah, but I want to, you know, just again, open the floor for further comments. We're kind of, we're at the end of our formal questions at this point. But if any of the panelists would like to add on to their thoughts that they've already, add on to their initial thoughts.
Yeah, I had something I wanted to say. I mean, you have 4 guests, panelists who are talking about the subject, and at least 2 of us, my brother is also incarcerated. And so the issue, you know, of prison narratives and morality and redemption are very, you know, it's always very messy in the African American community. And that article that that Brother Yao was just talking about, that just came out in the New York Times by Dwayne Betts about Kamala Harris, is taking that issue head on, because Black people, some of us are not sure what to make of the fact that there's somebody who works from one perspective on the wrong side of the issue, right? But my father is a retired DC Metropolitan police officer. He was a detective, and my brother's in prison. So none of this stuff is easily sorted through. You know, it's really, really messy and requires a lot of sensitivity. And if you start looking at statistics and the ways that who gets victimized by certain kinds of crime in particular, and then the issue of police, it's just really, really complicated. So that's part of why these stories are so important. We have to turn our focus. And in some ways, when I think about urban lit or street lit, it's about where the lens goes. You know, it's about where we look, you know, where we turn our attention, and then that we do so in a way that doesn't dehumanize and is sensitive to all of the complexities that many of us are dealing with every day on a daily basis.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you know, my question would be, Justin, you know, I'm interested in the relationship between what we would call the politicized narrative and Iceberg Slim. And just as you've studied and delved into his work, you know, did you notice instances of that? And if there was an absence of it, what do you attribute that to?
Yeah. The longer he goes on in the publishing game, the more political his work gets. Huh. And I mean, what I see, there's complications to that because, again, he's writing for these two white copywriters who are paying him $1,000 a novel, something like this. Absolutely not. I mean, he's actually getting the most of anybody at Holloway House. Donald Goines, who is, you know, also a writer there, is getting like $750.
I take the numbers.
So they're having to write. Yeah, they're having to write all the time. You know, like Goines writes 16 novels in 4 years, right? Because he's just in this fiction mill. Nevertheless, there are moments where someone like Iceberg Slim uses the novel form as a kind of secret vehicle for all of these radical politics. And specifically, I'm thinking here of The Naked Soul of Iceberg Slim, which he modeled both on Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk and Baldwin's Fire Next Time. And there's this key scene in that book where the day after the Panthers were in that gunfight with the police and Watts, he goes down there to like say, you know, I think you guys got a lot of balls and I want to be part of your organization. And they respond to him, we don't want no ex-pimps around here, right? So they reject Iceberg, but Iceberg's impulse at the core of him is this radical Black militancy that is emerging in the late 60s. And so there's always a valence of that in the folds of his work. And that's the place where I think it most explicitly comes out. And I would argue that this is the case with most of this street fiction, at least the early stuff that I really look at, like the Goines. He has all sorts of stories about secret underground organizations a la Spook Who Sat by the Door, who organize and basically, he asked the question, what would happen if the Panthers just went underground and formed their own political militia? What would that look like? And his fiction is an attempt to kind of narrate that possibility. And then it moves from being kind of realist fiction to being kind of speculative fiction. And this is what I find so fascinating about it, is that kind of straddles these genres. It uses the speculative as a way of articulating a radically political position.
Have you written that, Justin? Is that included in a work or a chapter of a work it is that you've created already?
Yeah, my first book is called Pimping Fictions, and it's a whole history of Black crime fiction. Yeah, there it is. Dennis has it, holding it up.
I'll meet you this week, Dennis, and snatch that from you. All right. I'm gonna use a pistol.
Well,
all right.
Clash of the Titans, then, brother.
So yeah, it starts from Chester Himes, who's pre-Slim, and it goes all the way up to Vicky Stringer. So you can take a look.
Wow. Can you talk about Vicky Stringer? Because we haven't discussed her.
Okay.
It's like we're discussing street life, but we haven't discussed I mean, she is a master not only of, you know, producing the book, but in some ways she is a master of negotiating with white publishing.
Yeah. Yeah.
She is the most sophisticated. The only person that stands on that level would be Zane, you know? Can you talk about her just a little bit?
Yeah, I don't want to take up everybody's time, but let me just say
I'm sorry.
Quick things. What's really great about Vicky Stringer is that she outsmarts Holloway House because she says,
oh, wow,
here's this new digital publishing thing. I'm going to publish my own books and sell them out of the trunk of my car. And in this way, you know, she mimics kind of what's going on with hip hop in the 80s and the 90s with books in the early 2000s. So she just runs around the Holloway House machine. And then additionally, she's like writing all of these stories that are basically like anti-Iceberg Slim. They're like the story of the street worker from the perspective of the woman in the situation.
Wow.
And revises the whole genre of street literature, putting a female perspective at front and center in the book. And she's kind of a leader of that, but there are many more. Wahida Clark's another. Terry Woods is another. But my last chapter of my Pimping Fiction books goes into this in detail. So check it out and let me know.
All right, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Yeah, if I may just jump in real quick. Yeah, I mean, another female street lit author who I'd want to throw in there also is Aya De Leon, whose books Uptown Thief, The Boss, The Mistress, right? All kind of do that same thing, but you know, and bringing in like Afro-Latina perspective as well, you know, and those narratives. So, you know, we only have a couple minutes left, but this has been such a great discussion that I don't really want it to end. Did anybody else have anything to say? Just any more gems to drop on us here? Nah.
Well, there were a lot of. Okay.
I know you didn't talk about your work, but I think you're one of the major. You're one of the major scholars that's actually done academic work on street life, both you and Dennis, you know?
Yeah.
So you guys maybe could talk a little bit about the work it is that you guys have done to just give a sense of who the moderators are and the people that had the perspective to bring us all together, you know?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, Street Lit, Representing the Urban Landscape is a book that I edited in 2013, and Dennis was a contributing author to. You know, it's the first multi-author critical volume on street lit as a genre, and is in there with like Christina Groff's work, Vanessa Irvin Morris's work, and various other, you know, kind of early street lit scholars. So that's where you know, we come at this from. We're also you know, planning on an expansion of that. Oh yeah, of course we have to mention too.
We've got to mention this. Street literature.
Yeah, because we are, of course, this whole festival and the Street Lit Symposium within it is brought to you by Words, Beats, and Life, the global journal of hip hop culture. And so our special Street Lit issue was part of that, just published only a few months ago. And then, yeah, we're planning Dennis and I are co-editing an expansion of, you know, both these texts really, you know, as a kind of larger book that will, you know, really, you know, seek to be as comprehensive as possible in terms of, you know, the academic kind of understanding of street lit. So, or just like a scholarly understanding of street lit. Dennis, anything you'd like to just add to what I said?
Well, nothing to add, just to sort of echo it. You know, the thing that I think is most impressive is, you know, Keenan and I met one another, I guess it was about 6 or 7 or maybe even 8 years ago. And, you know, I initially started working in street literature feeling a bit alone, right? And wanting to do this kind of work. You know, I was drawn to street literature as a 13-year-old, you know, scavenging through my mother's bookshelf and feeling a bit displaced in my high school and wanting to sort of read as a kind of radical response to the things that were assigned to me in my classes. and then still feeling that same bit of being an outsider as I'm going through graduate school. So, you know, I felt a little bit like a loner until I met Keenan. And then, you know, of course, the field is just wide open with so many scholars and writers doing this kind of work. So, you know, moments like this is just really reassuring. So with that said, I want to thank you all for taking part in this panel. I know that a lot of, well, all of our viewers will have a number of books, you know, on their list of things to read over the next few months. So thank you all for that. And please, this is a recorded, you know, session. So by all means, share this with folks. And thank you all again. Tomorrow night, we'll have our Street Lit in the Ivory Tower panel with David Green, Professor Khalid White, and Kamisha Randall. I'll be moderating that. That will begin at 6 o'clock, same channel, same space. So I'll see you all then. Thanks again, panel.
And thank you.